Okay, let's get started with class this morning. Last week we began a study of the time between the Testaments. And I'm trying, as I said last week, I'm trying to keep this relatively brief because the historical side of this thing, while it's fascinating to me and perhaps to some of you, may be less fascinating to others of you. And because this is a Bible class and not a history class, and there's not a lot, I mean, we're going to be referencing the scriptures where we can. And we are right now very much because we're kind of in the end of the Jewish state and then the resettling of Jerusalem and Judea. But in the following weeks, there's not a lot outside of Daniel that really speaks directly in the scriptures to the history that we're going to be looking at. And so I'm going to try to keep it to the maximum of 2 weeks per each era. And there's about 6 eras altogether that we're going to take a look at, moving from the end of the Persian Empire through the Roman Empire at the beginning of the time of Christ. And so right now, though, what we're looking at and what we just have gotten partway through is, that was interesting. And unfortunately, yes.
What?
He said somebody just hit a pole. Unfortunately, what it did is it interrupted enough of the flow to that thing that I'm going to have to turn it back on again. I still got the computer working, which is not surprising. It's a laptop. But and the other thing it may have done is killed the recording on the camera. So let's see. I'm hoping this will come back on again. The other possibility is that there was some kind of a circuit surge, in which case the
It's kind of like a flash. I wonder if it's
And Jerry's lights stayed on though, yeah.
Pardon?
The lights we put up, they stayed on.
Yeah.
There's only one thing that's not coming back on, and it's that.
There's a red light.
Well, at least it's got power, then that's good.
It needs to be reset.
Maybe. Let's try this. Can't tell what it says. Oh,
Is this going to affect how much time we have to do the test?
no. Lamp. Red. That's interesting. It tells me what probably happened is the lamp burned out.
It moved.
It moved?
Yeah, the
little light.
What moved?
The light
The
moved.
little indicator light.
It moved?
Yeah, I told you.
Oh, now it says something else. Power. Okay, well that's a good sign. Definitely prefer. Oh, actually I know what that was. When it turns off, it has a minimum cycle time to basically protect the lamp from overheating. So hopefully it will turn on now. The other thing I need to make sure of is that our camera is still recording. Which it is, so that's good. All right. It turned green. Green is a good color for this sort of thing anyway.
There we go.
Can't for long, but
Unfortunately, yes. All the other stuff is still,
Can't see it.
well, it's just waking up. So hang on. Give it a second here.
About a quarter.
Yeah, there's this whole process we have to go through that I do before most of you ever get here, and sadly, you're all going to get to see it now. All right.
Say sadly.
I view it as job security. If nobody else knows how to do it, how can you get rid of me? So, there we go. 93 minutes. All right, let's see if we can.
that chair. You have it?
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. All right, now we're back on track. See what, one little flash and everything gets messed up. All right, so where we are at right now is we're talking about Medo-Persia. The first thing we looked at in particular is Babylon. Babylon is the nation that conquered Israel, or actually conquered Judah and took them into captivity after Assyria had already taken Israel into captivity. Babylon removed all of the people of Israel, or of Judah, at least most of them. There were a few that were left over, but all of the nobility, all the leaders, and the majority of the people were all deported. But then when Medo-Persia came about, what we saw last week is that in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, this is what we're looking at here, Cyrus, the king of Persia, when he ascended the throne his very first year, he ordered that he ordered a proclamation that said that the Lord, basically the Lord had spoken to him. And in fact, Isaiah and other, are you kidding me?
No, they're not doing
Apparently
that.
not. This is not going to be fun.
He's lonely.
Yeah, great. This is the sort of stuff I really dislike. It's also the sort of stuff we haven't had a problem with in a long time.
Just, I'm doing this. When wants to see.
And now I can't find it.
I try not to drink too much when I have.
So Persia is approximately where Iran is?
I'll show you in a second, actually. It's one of the, I think it's the next thing we've got is a map, so.
And what does Medo
What's her
mean
name?
when you say Medo?
Oh,
It's
what?
Midianite.
Media was a separate country, and Persia was a separate country, and they eventually united into a single empire, the Medes and the Persians.
Oh, okay.
So, I don't know what just happened here. That's not good. Yeah. That was, usually when that picture comes up, something really wrong has happened. There it is again. Oh, good. There we go. All right, let's try it again. I do not think this is promising. All right, well, let's see how long this lasts. The real concern I have is less about this class, because I can do this off of my notes and than what is going to happen during the services. So we'll see. All right, let's try this again. Okay, so the Medo-Persian Empire, the Medes and the Persians, succeeded the Babylonian Empire, and essentially they took it over. And there was a series of battles, but ultimately there was a bloodless coup that allowed the Medes and Persians to come in and take over Babylon itself, the city itself. They simply took it over. And so Cyrus, when he ascended the throne this was a few years after that had happened, he announced that the Lord had given him his throne. Basically, he recognized Jehovah God. The Lord that's used in there is the word Yahweh, which is actually a recognition of Jehovah. And he actually says that God appointed him to build a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So he says, whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. So he allows the Jews to return to Israel, to the land of Judah, and to Jerusalem in particular, to rebuild the temple of God. And so, I think I've got the map in here. Let me see. Maybe I went. There we go. Okay, sorry, the map was back here. So, initially, the Babylonian Empire was kind of in this area here. Egypt had controlled its own empire down here. Greece and some other states were up here. And Medo-Persia was this big area here. But eventually they took over Babylon first, and then Egypt, and then also a significant part of what is Turkey, well, all of Turkey and some of Greece as well. So they ultimately ended up conquering and becoming what was at the time the biggest empire in the world. Now, the later empires of Greece and Rome would eclipse them in size, particularly Rome. But initially, at least, they were the largest, or at that point, they were the largest empire in the world. And of course, one of the areas they control, and really only a minor part of their territory, is Jerusalem and Judea, this little sliver down in here. But they controlled all of that, and Cyrus allowed the Israelites to go back to their nation and go back to their territories. And Cyrus is actually the only king that is a foreign king who is spoken of in unequivocally positive terms in the entire scriptures. Even kings like Nebuchadnezzar that God gave success to is also spoken of negatively when he became proud or arrogant. Cyrus never seems to have done that. There's nothing negative in the entire scriptures about him. Isaiah speaks very, very kindly about him. The prophecies about him are very, very kind. So Cyrus allows the refugees to go back. And this was prophesied by Jeremiah, where Jeremiah had given a prophecy that he said, I shall give them over to the power of those who are seeking their lives, even into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hands of his officers. This is the people that are going to be taken away into captivity. Afterwards, however, it will be inhabited as in the days of old, declares the Lord. But as for you, O Jacob, my servant, do not fear nor be dismayed, O Israel. For see, I am going to save you from afar, and your descendants from the land of captivity, and Jacob will return and be undisturbed and secure, with no one making him tremble. And this prophecy was given about 70 years, 75 years before the Israelites were returned by Cyrus. What's even more impressive is the prophecy in Isaiah, where Isaiah says, it is I, that's the Lord, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desire, and he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple, your foundation will be laid. This is impressive because Isaiah's prophecy came about 200 years, 250 years, something like that, before Cyrus was even born. And what's fascinating is that it calls him by name as the guy who's going to come and do this. Long before there was even a Medo-Persian empire, God was prophesying about the man, the king, who was going to return his people to their land, and he was going to have his temple rebuilt. So the plans that God put in place to return the Israelites and the people of Judah were long the plans were made long before it actually was carried out. So what we see then in Ezra is Ezra starts talking about that return that takes place. Now initially Ezra himself does not go with them, but in Ezra chapter 1 it says, the heads of fathers' households of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites arose, even everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. And all those about them, this would be the people of the Medes and the Persians, encouraged them with articles of silver, with gold, with goods, with cattle, and with valuables, aside from all that was given as a freewill offering. Also Cyrus brought out the articles of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and put in the house of his gods. And Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought out by the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer, and he counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. So we see Cyrus is the king that allows the Israelites, the people of Judah specifically, to go back to their home. And when he sends them back, he sends them with all of the goods that had been taken out of the temple, the various instruments that were used, the sacred things that were used for the worship of God. He let them take that back with them, along with a lot of gifts that were given to them by the people who lived around them. So the Israelites are repatriated under Cyrus. Now his successor is a guy named Xerxes, and Xerxes is referred to as Ahasuerus in Esther, and throughout the scriptures for reasons, well, that was one of his other names, and I'm not quite clear on why they used that word rather than Xerxes, but nevertheless, Ahasuerus is the name that they use in Esther. And so we see in Esther, we see taking place after the Israelites or the people of Judah have been allowed to go home, but a lot of them stayed behind. A lot of them remained in Babylon, and one of those was Esther and, of course, her uncle Mordecai. And so in the days of Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, and I'm not going to go through the whole story of Esther because hopefully you know it already, and if you don't, it would take too long to tell it here. But the point is that Esther takes place and is placed firmly within the realm of the reign of Xerxes, who succeeded Cyrus on the throne. So then it says, in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, there's the Medes and the Persians, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. So this is all very much in keeping with some of the practices of the royalty under the Medes and the Persians. It was a very, there was a lot of formality, there were a lot of celebrations, and because look at the successes they were having, and every time they won another battle, they had another big party. And so this is the sort of thing that goes on there. So again, Esther is placed within the context of after the return of the exiles, they've been allowed to go home, but a lot of the Jews have remained in Babylon and in Medo-Persia and various places, and she is going to become ultimately the queen of King Xerxes. So then we skip back to Ezra, because Ezra kind of bookends this. The events in Ezra and Nehemiah actually start with the return of the Israelites, or the people of Judah from Babylon, from Persia, and they end several kings later. And so if we look at here, we see they finished building according to the command of the God of Israel. This is the temple that they're building. According to the command of the God of Israel and the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Actually, I forgot that Darius, there was actually Cyrus, then Darius, then Xerxes, and then Artaxerxes, who was his son. So it took the entirety of it took parts of the reign of 4 different kings for the Israelites to finally finish rebuilding the temple. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar. It was the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Okay, so Darius is actually, getting this mixed up, sorry. Ezra is confusing because Ezra tells a story and then it talks about when Ezra himself shows up and it sort of resets the chronology. And so I had to read it about 4 times and I'm still getting mixed up about it. So the temple is completed during the reign of Darius, who succeeded Cyrus. Xerxes, and then Artaxerxes succeed Darius after that. So, no. Wait.
Yes.
No, actually, I'm sorry, because Artaxerxes is not, it's a different Artaxerxes. Unfortunately, the chronology is confusing here. I don't have all of my notes with me, so unfortunately I'm a little mixed up about this. This is actually, I believe, a different Artaxerxes, because this is, I'm not even sure he's actually a king. He may have been more like a governor, but in any event, the correct order is Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes. I'm just not sure which Artaxerxes this one is talking about. But anyway, the point that is actually more important here is that the temple rebuilding was sponsored by the kings of Persia and was funded largely by the kings of Persia. Jared.
One thing that happened under Cyrus that becomes important with those other 4 kings is his decree that finally got buried and had to be looked up, but it gave authority for everybody to help build that temple, and that went down the line with those kings, and that comes to be very important in future years after they come back and start to rebuild the temple.
Right. There is opposition to the rebuilding of the temple, and ultimately when Ezra has gone, so a number of years after the temple has already started being built, Ezra goes, and Ezra, in the course of trying to get the project moving along, is able to send messages back to Persia, and to the king there, that causes them to dig up this old decree and realize, yeah, we were supposed to be helping all along, and the people that are trying to prevent this from happening were not supposed to be having any sort of authority in this. And so there is this whole series of things that goes along here, and unfortunately, the Book of Ezra, like I said, is if you read it, it makes sense, but it's can also be a little bit confusing because it does kind of move back and forth in time a little bit, so it can be a bit difficult. Anyway, so what is going on here? Okay, actually, I think I've gone back in time here. So part of the reason I'm getting this confused is because I've got duplicate slides in here. So okay, so here we go. Now we're back to Ezra. Okay, so now this is making sense to me again. So we had the initial stuff at Ezra where they go to build the temple. And that's under Cyrus and Darius. Then we have what takes place within Esther, which is under Xerxes. Then we come to the actual king Artaxerxes, and this is when these 3 guys, whose names I'm not even going to try to pronounce, and the rest of his colleagues wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. The text of the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic, and basically this letter is written to them to try to get to them to stop try to make the Jews stop building their temple. And initially, at least, that's what Artaxerxes does, because he gets this letter from these people, and it sounds like the Jews are in rebellion or whatever else. So Artaxerxes tells them you have to stop building, and there's this halt in the building. So finally, then in Ezra chapter 7, it says, now after these things, in the reign of Artaxerxes, there went up Ezra, son of Sariah, and it goes through this whole list of his backgrounds, son of Aaron, the chief priest. Ezra went up from Babylon. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given. So Ezra goes up, and it says, the king granted him all he requested because the hand of the Lord his God was upon him. So some of the priests of Israel and some of the priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, temple servants went up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. So what happens then is Artaxerxes allows him to go up, and like I said, he is able to get the process moving again. They find the decree of Cyrus, and they get back on track, and they finish the temple once Ezra gets there. Over in Nehemiah, sometime later, so notice Ezra goes up in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. 13 years later, Nehemiah who is he's a servant of King Artaxerxes. It says that while this is Nehemiah, was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity. And I asked them about Jerusalem, and they said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire. So even though they managed to rebuild the temple, the wall of Jerusalem was still destroyed, which meant that Jerusalem itself was very vulnerable to the threats from around it. So,
Ryan,
yes,
not to throw you off.
please do.
No, so Nehemiah and Esther are contemporaries because Nehemiah just talked to,
Ezra, you mean? Did you
well,
mean?
Esther married Artaxerxes.
Yes, I guess you would be, that's true.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Nehemiah is entering into the palace of Esther's husband. Is
That's
that
true.
correct? Okay,
Yeah,
just
I don't
making
really thought
sure.
about it that way, but that's true, yes.
Okay, just making
So,
sure.
yeah, so let me do this, so if we go to this thing, we'll take a look at it. So here's the sequence now. There's a couple of kings in there. Xerxes is Esther's husband, that's right.
Okay, sorry.
Artaxerxes is the son of,
Okay.
it's confusing because Xerxes, his other name is Ahasuerus, which sounds more like, yeah. So, but he might very well have been a contemporary of hers, broadly speaking, because their ages almost certainly would have overlapped. But there are a couple of kings in between Cyrus and Darius, or Darius and Xerxes, that reign for very short times. But the primary kings of Medo-Persia, the ones that are significant, are Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great, who allowed exiles to return. That was in 539 BC. Darius I, who also called himself Darius the Great, who was under his reign that the Second Temple was completed in 515. And so they're able to complete the temple, but what is not being done is to rebuild the rest of Jerusalem. Xerxes I is the one that married Esther. Artaxerxes is the one that authorized Ezra and Nehemiah to oversee the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And that takes place from about, there's the specific authorization in 458, and then between 445 and 433 is when the rebuilding takes place. And it's at 433 that the wall of Jerusalem is rebuilt, and actually, it's in 433 that the book of the final part of the book of Nehemiah is written. So Nehemiah oversees the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and then he goes back to the king for some period of time, and returns in 433 to find out that everything hasn't quite stayed the way it's supposed to. We'll get to that in a second here. But so these are the four kings of Medo-Persia, the really significant ones. These are the things that are taking place in here, and basically, at the end of 433, that's about when we run into the end of the scripture, of the Old Testament. There's really no more prophecy or historical records or anything else like that until the New Testament after that. Okay? So, the three empires that we've looked at here. The first one is the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire conquered a significant amount of this. Egypt was largely free from them until near the very end of the Assyrian Empire. Interestingly, the one little place that the Assyrians didn't conquer in all of this other territory was Jerusalem and Judah. This is the one area that they never conquered because God protected them under Hezekiah and others. It wasn't until Babylon took over from Assyria, conquered all of their territory and some more, that Jerusalem was finally conquered. And then ultimately, so you see here, you've got this Lydia, which is basically a proto-Greek empire, Egypt, Babylon, and the Medes and the Persians over here, and ultimately then what happens is Media and Persia get together and they conquer all of it. So that's where we end with the Old Testament. Essentially ends at that point. So the question then, or the important things to understand in terms of moving from the Old Testament to the New Testament, are how social, cultural, economic factors changed between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So one of the things that we see happening between those two times is the development of non-temple worship. Now, in the Old Testament, there actually is a lot of non-temple worship. What does it usually take the form of?
The Levites out in the countryside and working with the people. That would be part of it.
Some of that, but what is it? I mean, you're thinking too much about the worship of God Almighty.
Oh.
What does the non-temple worship usually take the form of in the Old Testament?
Idols.
Idols, idolatry. So it's household gods, it's the high places that have been set up in various places. And in some cases, those high places or certain high places are used to offer sacrifices. Samuel in particular offered sacrifices on high places on a number of occasions. To God, not to idols, of course. What's that?
I was saying Second Chronicles talks
Okay,
about
Second Chronicles
offering,
talks about-
offering sacrifices
Right.
to God on those high places.
Right. And so what most of the non-temple worship tended to look like when there was a people that were coming together to worship, it still tended to look like sacrificial kinds of worship where offerings were being made and things like that. So one of the main changes that happens during the time between the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the return of the exiles, and even afterwards when there were still a lot of exiles in Babylon and in the places that they were deported to by Assyria, in the case of the Israelites, is they start to develop a form of worship that's not sacrifice-based and isn't temple-based, and it's based around a concept called, well, what we see actually in Daniel is Daniel, when he's ordered by the then king of Persia, everybody's ordered not to worship anybody except the king. It says he knew the document was signed, the document that made that order, but nevertheless he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. What we see is that even though the exiles are sent off into captivity, they continue to worship God, not just individually, but also as groups. And I can't find a scripture that talks about the group type of worship, but we know from history that they began to develop ways of worshiping as groups. And in particular, what they developed was something called a minyan, not the little yellow things from the Despicable Me series, but rather minyan was a quorum of 10 Jewish adults. And that quorum was required for formal religious activities. Now, a smaller group of Jews could get together and worship. They could pray together, and they could, read the scriptures or talk about, those kinds of things. But to do anything formal, such as the public reading of scripture or public prayers, things like that, those things needed at least 10 Jewish adults. An adult was defined as a male over the age of 13. Today it's defined as, in some, depending on whether you're talking about Orthodox Jews or less Orthodox Jews, it's either males over the age of 13 or anybody over the age of 13. But either way, back then it would have been males over the age of 13. So if you had 10 or more males over the age of 13, you could come together and have a formal worship service. And that was something that developed as a necessity out of the fact that you didn't have access to the temple or really access to ways to sacrifice at all. In general, doing things like sacrifice were not something that the empires and the places where they'd been deported to permitted. And so they began to develop forms of worship that were not derived directly from or not focused directly on the temple worship. This is eventually going to become the predecessor to the synagogues, but the synagogues do not get started this early on. So, okay, where do they get the idea of 10 adults? Well, they go in and they go into a reading of several different passages. Leviticus chapter 22, verse 32, God says, "And I shall be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel." And in Hebrew, the notion of being sanctified is being set apart, and midst has it sounds like 10. That's the best way I can say it. There's a lot of things in Hebrew that are sounds like, and they do plays on words. And so a lot of the things where you have like, so-and-so's name means this, it's because it sounds like that, not because it means that. And so there's a lot of plays on words like this. But they find this. So the same thing over in Numbers chapter 16. Separate yourselves from the midst of the congregation. Midst has a connotation of 10. The congregation has a connotation of a larger group. Same thing over in Numbers. How long shall I bear with this evil congregation which murmur against me? And there again, they drew out of that this notion of that there's a group concept, but they ultimately came to this notion of gathering together in a number, and that 10 was the minimum number. And I don't follow all of this. I didn't go too deep into this because I don't really feel like learning Hebrew in detail for a class that I'm only going to try to teach for about 10 weeks or something like that. But essentially, minyan, the notion of minyan comes out of these passages talking about in the midst or a portion of the larger congregation of Israel. Okay, so they begin to develop non-temple worship in a non-sacrificial context. The next thing that we see happening is the dominance of the Levitical priesthood. And I say that, and you might think, well, that sounds, why is it just now happening? If you go and you read in the books of Genesis, or of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they set up all this stuff. There's a temple, there's a tabernacle, and there's a temple. There's priests in the background, at least, of almost all of the books of the, of the history of, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, there's all of these discussions of the Levites and the priests and everything else. So why are they only now becoming dominant? And what's interesting is that in looking at the history of Israel and of Judah, it's very difficult to find a lot of significant roles that the priests actually played in Israel until Ezra and Nehemiah go back and sort of reestablish it. When you look, even if you look in 1st and 2nd Samuel, when probably, unquestionably, the most godly of all the kings ever to sit on the throne of Israel is David. And yet, with the exception of a couple specific examples, most particularly when he brings the ark from the edge of Israel into Jerusalem, there's almost no discussion of the priests or of the temple or of the tabernacle or of the worship that goes on there. And it appears that the reality is, and it makes sense because over and over again, God criticizes the people for forsaking him and for not worshiping him and for not taking care of the Levites and things like that. But it certainly appears from history that very early on, the Israelites basically just kind of said, you know what, this is not a big deal to us. And they never really put the level of dedication into the temple and into the significance of the Levitical priesthood that they were intended to. And so what changes is that when they go into exile and when they return back to the land, they're kind of determined not to make the same mistakes they did in the past. And so there's much more of a focus on rebuilding the temple and on honoring the priesthood. And that's helped along by the fact that one of the main guys who goes to establish all of this is Ezra, who is himself a priest. What we see happening in 1st Chronicles, actually, and this is actually just a background thing. This is talking about the sons, the lineage of David, going down to the final kings of Israel. Jehoiakim, his sons were Jeconiah, who was also known as Jehoiachin, Zedekiah, his son, sons of Jeconiah, the prisoner, this is the guy who was taken into captivity in Babylon, were Shealtiel, his son, Malchiram, Pedaiah, Shenazar, Jechemiah, Hoshama, and Nedabiah. The sons of Pedaiah, this is the only part that's really important about this, were Zerubbabel and Shimei. And Zerubbabel is the important one because Zerubbabel will keep showing up in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So in Ezra, the people that came up out of captivity, of the exiles who Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away to Babylon, that returned to Jerusalem and Judea, they came with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Reliah, and Mordecai. And I include the first two names because they're really important because Zerubbabel is the actual, the descendant of the king. And this is kind of interesting actually for two reasons. First of all, it means that an actual descendant of David went back who actually had claim to the throne, but he doesn't actually ascend the throne. What's particularly interesting to me about this, just in terms of history, is the fact that he was allowed to go back shows just how generous Cyrus was. Because under normal circumstances, a king who had conquered a nation and had to take pretty much the whole nation into captivity just to keep them from continuing to rebel, would never allow a person to go back who could legitimately claim the throne if he let them go back there again. And so the fact that Cyrus allowed Zerubbabel, the descendant of David, who had a legitimate claim to the throne, to go back to Israel or go back to Jerusalem, speaks to just how serious he was about this idea of letting the Jews go back into their own homeland. That didn't mean he was going to be okay with Zerubbabel setting up the throne again, and Zerubbabel doesn't do that, but it does mean that he understood that how important it was that they go back there. Jeshua is also important because Jeshua is the high priest, or the descendant of the high priest, and so he's important from that standpoint. I put the other names in there, Nehemiah, because just to say this is not the same Nehemiah as the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah doesn't go back until a long time after this. And Mordecai is also not the same Mordecai as in the book of Esther. These names just happen to be in there. They're people with similar names, and they're relatively common names at that period of time. And so these other people that go back are just leaders of the people, family leaders, things like that. So these people go back, led by a son of David and a high priest, essentially. They go back to the land. It's interesting, though, that when they go back there, in the 7th month, so the 7th month is when a whole bunch of the Jewish festivals would take place, most notably the day of the Passover. And so 7th month is a day of significance. And so the people get back to the land of Israel, and in the 7th month they gather together as one man in Jerusalem. And Jeshua the son of Jozadak and his brothers the priests, and Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and his brothers arose and built the altar of God to offer burnt offerings on it. And what's interesting here is the significance And the prominence that they give to the priest, they list the priest before they list the son of the king, which is unusual, but it suggests a prioritization of the priesthood in terms of the leadership function from this point on. And so then we get to that, and this is very simple. This is a passage I read before, so I'm just going to skim through this. But in Ezra chapter 7, it says Ezra, who is a priest, he's of the lineage of Aaron. He goes up to Jerusalem as well. Now, he is not qualified to be the high priest because, in terms of the lineage, essentially the guy who's already there, Jeshua, is more directly in line with Aaron to be the high priest. And so he goes back not to become the high priest, but rather to try to make sure that things are getting done. And it says he went up from Babylon, the hand of the Lord was on him. The priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, they went up there with him. And he came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was the 7th year of the king. On the first day of the 1st month, he began to go up from Babylon. On the 1st of the 5th month, he came to Jerusalem because the good hand of his God was on him. So, yes?
One thing that you might point out is that the gatekeepers and the singers are Levites.
That's true. And in fact, there's a bunch of Levites that go up with the initial group that goes. There's a bunch of Levites that go up with Ezra. And then, I didn't put this in here, but then Ezra goes and gets even more of them from other places and takes them with him to Judah. So there end up being a whole bunch of Levites along with quite a few priests that are there in Jerusalem. And so he goes up, and we don't have time to go through all this, but I would encourage you to read the book of Ezra. It's not a real long book, and it's very interesting because it goes through and talks about all the things that are done. And essentially, the book of Ezra is almost entirely concerned with the rebuilding of the temple and with basically putting the priesthood back in the position of leadership in Israel. The goal is to basically have Israel go back to being what it was supposed to be, which is a theocratic society, essentially, where their leadership and their focus is around God and not around any particular man. And so even though Zerubbabel is there, Zerubbabel is a leader, but he is not the king, and ultimately he kind of lets the priests take the lead in this. And that's kind of what the book of Ezra is about, and so we see this over and over again. And because Ezra is so deeply involved in that process, it's not surprising that the result is that the priesthood is kind of set up as the leadership role. And they basically maintain that role up through the 1st century, although ultimately the significance of their role diminishes as some abuses take place, but that's a way out yet, so we're not going to get to that today. Over in Nehemiah, yes?
Brian, the one thing that I think is important and throughout this entire 400 years is that the lineage is kept records of it.
Yeah.
And it becomes very important when you get to Matthew and Luke, when he lists that lineage and it shows the fulfillment of that prophecy he made way back.
That's true. The lineage of Christ is able to be traced because the lineage of particularly of the people of Judah is maintained, and so the king's lineage in particular is maintained, and so they're able to see that he's not just Jesus is not just from Judah, but that he's actually of the line of Christ or the line of David as well. So, okay, so Nehemiah also, what happens with Nehemiah is that Nehemiah finds that after he comes the second time, he goes away, he comes back, and he says he discovers that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who performed the service had gone away, each to his own field. So what happens basically is the Levites, all these Levites have come to serve, but the people aren't giving them the tithe that they're supposed to, and the result is that they've all gone home because they have to do something to keep their lives intact, and so they have to go home and they go to their own fields, they farm and raise animals and stuff. And so it says he reprimanded the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" And he gathered them together, restored them to their posts, and all Judah then brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And in charge of the storehouses he appointed Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites. They were considered reliable, and it was their task to distribute to their kinsmen. And then he finishes by saying, "Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out my loyal deeds, which I have performed to the house of my God and its services." So even though Nehemiah is not a Levite, he is very much in the tradition of Ezra, trying to maintain the role of the priests and the Levites as that centerpiece of Judean society. And so this idea keeps being preserved. So the dominance of the Levitical priesthood is the second thing. The third thing is the elimination of mixed race marriage. Now, this had been a problem back in the Old Testament before they were deported to Babylon. To some extent, it had become a much bigger problem once they went back into the land, because there'd been a lot of mixed race marriages that had gone on with the people that were left behind. But it keeps going on even when the Israelites that return from Babylon get into the land, they continue that tradition, so to speak. And so Nehemiah, when he goes back to visit again after the initial temple's been set up, the wall's been rebuilt, he goes to Artaxerxes, but he returns back again, and he says, in those days, I saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. As for their children, half spoke in the language of Ashdod, and none of them was able to speak the language of Judah, the language of his own people. So he says, I came back and found out that they've been intermarrying again, to the point where half of them, many of them, didn't even speak their actual, the Hebrew tongue. So I contended with them and cursed them and struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God. God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. So he says, you can't keep doing this. He says, do we then hear about you that you have committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God, by marrying foreign women? Even one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Elisha, the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite, who was actually one of the enemies of Israel. So I drove him away from me. So even the priests had begun intermarrying with people from the nations around them. And so Nehemiah puts a stop to this. He says, remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I purified them from everything foreign and appointed duties for the priests and the Levites, each to his task. So by this time, Ezra has probably died. In fact, it's almost certain that Ezra would never have allowed this to happen in the first place. But Ezra passes away at some point. Nehemiah, who was younger than him and whose chronicle takes place about 15 years after Ezra starts, Nehemiah goes back and he finds this distressing situation, puts it right, and it appears that from that point on, the people of Israel that are living in the land finally do get the message, and they stop intermarrying and they become more pure in that regard. And again, the temple and temple worship becomes central to the identity of the Israelites there. Okay, so the next thing that we see is the rise of Jewish-Samaritan hostility. The Samaritans, we talked about this last week, the Samaritans were a race that basically came in after the Israelites had been deported. They came in and they were what's left of the Israelite people that hadn't been deported by the Assyrians, and then the peoples from the land around them, a lot of whom were at least distantly related to the Israelites because they were descendants of Abraham through some of his other sons. But they came into the land of Israel, they took over and basically began living there, and in fact they even helped contribute when Hezekiah, I believe it was Hezekiah, that was Josiah, was doing some work to basically fix up the temple and stuff. They helped contribute to fixing up the temple because at the time at least they considered themselves to be of a similar heritage, and so the Samaritans developed a worship of God, and they were worshiping what they called, who they believed was God Almighty, and they were worshiping on high places, not so much by doing idolatrous things, but by sacrificing and by praying and those kinds of things. And so they kind of had this weird sort of hybrid of worship of God and also sort of nature worship that kind of came together there. And for quite a long time, the Jews and the Samaritans lived in relative harmony. The Samaritans were up north, the Jews were down south, and the Jews were taken into captivity. And the Samaritans kind of took over some of their land, but then when the Jews returned, that meant that the Samaritans that were there kind of got displaced by their return, and that started to create some hostility. And in particular, the Samaritans started to try to do everything they could to undermine the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. What's interesting, though, is that that's not exactly how it starts out. If we go over and look at Ezra, it says, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the people of the exile were building a temple to the Lord God, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' households and said to them, let us build with you, for we, like you, seek your God. What's interesting about this is that when you look at the history, if it weren't for the fact that somebody who's inspired was writing this down, I would think that his biases might be getting in the way of seeing that somebody was legitimately offering him something beneficial. Because it appears, at least on the surface of it, they're saying, hey, we want to go back to the relationship we used to have, where we helped, pay for some of the repairs and the upgrades to the temple. We want to go back and we want to help with that again. But Ezra recognizes, or at least the people of Israel, Ezra's not even there yet, the people of Israel recognize that there's something illegitimate about this. And so he says, they said, we've been sacrificing to him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us up here. So many of the Samaritans were actually brought into the land by the Assyrians since they wanted to have somebody in there once they deported the Israelites. But Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of the heads of the fathers' households of Israel said to them, you have nothing in common with us in building a house to our God. But we ourselves will together build to the Lord God of Israel as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and frightened them for building. So once they say, no, we're going to do it ourselves, the Samaritans begin to oppose the effort. And so it says they hired counselors against them to frustrate their counsel all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia, and in the reign of Ahasuerus, that's Xerxes. In the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So they basically begin to oppose the rebuilding and to cause all these different problems. And they're going to continue that all the way through the rebuilding of the temple, all the way through the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And ultimately, this is kind of the beginning of the enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans. And there's going to be stuff that goes back and forth on both sides that makes it worse. But this is where it all kind of gets started, is that they are doing their best to prevent the Jews from consolidating their hold religiously and also physically on the land of Judah. Okay, last thing, real quick. One of the biggest changes, and in some ways one of the most significant ones, is the widespread use of Aramaic. And the reason that this is significant is because Aramaic is the first language to gain a significant foothold in terms of becoming a common language. Okay? Now later on, Greek is going to become even more the way that is. And today, English has become the closest thing to a common language that we have worldwide. Almost anybody who engages in large-scale transactions throughout the world can speak a little bit of English. And that was the case with Greek, and that was even the case with Aramaic back then. The first time we see Aramaic mentioned in the New Testament, the Old Testament, is when when it's Assyria has invaded, and it says that basically what happens is that a couple of men of Assyria go walking around the walls of Jerusalem, talking to the people of Jerusalem and telling them that they're going to be destroyed and how they're going to lose the battle and everything else. And so the leaders of Jerusalem go out and they say, speak now to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it, and do not speak with us in Judean in the hearing of the people who are on the wall. But they don't want the people to get discouraged, basically. And so they already are saying, we speak Aramaic. And this is actually at the point that Babylon has come. So then in Daniel we see the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, his spirit was troubled, his sleep left him. This is Babylon. The king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. And they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I had a dream. My spirit is anxious to understand the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. So again, we see within the Babylonian Empire, Aramaic is being spoken. And finally, it says in the days of Artaxerxes, these three guys that wrote a letter, wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and the text of the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic. So what's happening is Aramaic is becoming a significant common language. And by the time of even the first century, Aramaic is still going to become one of the major languages that's spoken, and most Jews are going to speak Aramaic in addition to speaking Hebrew. Yes?
So did the Assyrians bring in the Aramaic?
Kind of. Aramaic is funny because it wasn't really created by any one nation. It kind of is a mixing of a number of different languages that are sort of Middle Eastern languages. And the Assyrians are the first people to start using it like significantly, right, to where it becomes a major thing for them. But it's not really entirely their language,
It's like Spanglish?
It's kind of like that, In some ways, it would be kind of like, you think about English is spoken by Americans, but Americans did not invent English by any means. Now, actually, English is relatively easy to trace because it traces to England. But Aramaic is unusual because it's kind of this I don't know, you just come from a lot of different places. So, but you're right, the Assyrians are the ones who really begin to use it heavily in their transactions and in their records and stuff like that. And that's a major reason why it becomes so important, because since their empire is so big, it spreads throughout their empire. And then it's continued under the Babylonians and continued under the Medes and the Persians, and it continues on through, even through the first century, being used as a major language that's understood by a lot of different people. And Aramaic has elements of Hebrew in it as well as other languages, which is also one of the reasons probably why the Israelites were more willing to speak it. And later on, when we talk about Greece, we'll talk about one of the reasons why Israelites would be more willing to speak Aramaic than they would to speak Greek. And there's a lot of things that the Israelites hate about the Greek people, and their language is one of them. So ultimately, they don't want to speak Greek because they hate the Greeks. So they speak Aramaic. But anyway, it's important because this is one of the first times in history that we see a common tongue originating that's being spoken by lots of people in lots of nations throughout the known world at the time.
Since Genesis.
Since Genesis, yes, since the Tower of Babel, yes. But I didn't want to use that reference because the tower, prior to the Tower of Babel, it was truly one language.
Yeah.
Whereas this is still just one of many. So, all right, that's it, guys. I'm sorry we went a little bit over time, but I wanted to finish it up. Next week we're going to start talking about Greece, actually. So we're going to spend a couple of weeks talking about Greece and the impact that they have on the Israelites.